Good morning, and thanks again for all this invitation to Conor and Camilo. And now we are going to session number 4. It's about political kidnapping, civil society, and social justice. I am the chair. I am professor at the Fit University in Medellin. And now we are going to have Temitope Oriola from the University of Alberta, Canada. Okay.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for having me. I really appreciate it. Kidnapping and oil politics, the case of Nigeria. Many of you may be familiar with these images and imageries of disheveled oil workers paraded in the full glare of global TV cameras in Nigeria's oil-rich Delta region. And of course, the ubiquitous illegal oil bunkering or oil theft as well. These images are important because Nigeria is a major world oil producer, and developments in the Niger Delta region have an adverse consequence on the global price of crude oil. I'll be speaking quite a lot about the Niger Delta, and by the Niger Delta, I'm talking about the geopolitical zone somewhere here, 9 states out of Nigeria's 36 states, so states like Ondo, Edo, Delta, Bayelsa, Rivers. These are the states to which I refer when I talk about the Niger Delta states. In terms of context, oil exploration began in the late 1930s. I'm going to skip quite a lot over there. At the moment, it's believed that there are over 1,500 oil-producing communities, thousands of kilometers of pipelines and oil wells. And of course, oil remains a major source of revenue for the Nigerian government, generating about 90% of all foreign earnings for the country. But in spite of the salience of this region to the Nigerian state, the very existence of the Nigerian state, it is marked by very grim statistics in terms of Human Development Index. The unemployment rates are some of the highest in the country. It's also plagued by egregious practices by state forces. And of course, environmental degradation, which I wouldn't have time to go into in any detail. But I'm happy to speak about that during the Q&A. And of course, there are angst around the use of the resources from the region in developing a city such as Abuja, which was built from scratch, essentially from proceeds from crude oil from the Niger Delta region, while the region remains fundamentally undeveloped. The full set of grievances of insurgents who are involved in kidnapping and other forms of insurgent activities in the region, there are 5 of them in that descending order of significance. The Nigerian state occupies the pyramidal peak. Transnational oil corporations are also entities that insurgents generally take on, as well as their workers. And of course, federated states and so forth. In terms of a range of activities of insurgents, kidnapping of oil workers is just one of several things that insurgents there are involved in. Car bombings were introduced in 2010. The destruction of oil infrastructure also has a fairly long history in the region. Now, for more to my study, the key question that I sought out to investigate was, is kidnapping of oil workers in the Niger Delta region a form of protest or sheer criminal expropriation? And for the purposes of this workshop, what are the implications of the kidnapping of oil workers in this region for kidnappings in other contexts? Now, in terms of methods, this is a qualitative study, so with 6 sets of participants. The study began as far back as 2009. The first phase involved 114 participants, 42 of whom were male insurgents who, by their own admission, participated actively in kidnapping oil workers. And I was also able to speak with female insurgents in 2012. I'm happy to say more about the methods during the Q&A. Just pictures from my field trip. Clearly, I was much younger at the time that this study began. The years do fly by. I'm reminded of, well. And of course, interviews with female insurgents in the region. Now, some of you may be familiar with this. In 2007, 4 American oil workers were kidnapped in the Delta region. And this made front page news around the world because invariably the American government was essentially interpellated in the crisis. Interestingly, when the American workers were rescued, or not rescued, released by insurgents following negotiations, they actually talked about being treated very well by the insurgents and actually being compassionate towards the insurgents given what was going on in the region, that they were exposed to the contradictions in the region. Now, this group was called the Niger Delta Freedom Fighters, and the guy who set up this group, Henry Bindo Doha, was kind enough to grant me an interview right in the area in which the American oil workers were kept. Now, this is probably a more familiar face, Sari Dokubo, who was the very first individual back in the early 2000s called for the explicit use of violence against the Nigerian state. And his group, the Niger Delta Volunteer Force, was the very first group to engage in kidnapping of oil workers in what I consider the intersection of the second and the third wave of the kidnapping, a point to which I return in a moment. Asari Dokubo also was kind enough to get me an interview back in 2010 in his hotel room in Abuja, which was interesting because he was a wanted man at the time.
You're like Kaden.
Yeah, and this is Ken Saro-Wiwa Jr., the scion of Ken Saro-Wiwa Sr., the human rights and environmental justice activist who, alongside members of the Ogoni Nine, were tried by a military tribunal and summarily executed in November of 1995. Ken and I had a conversation back in 2010. Unfortunately, Ken Jr. passed away rather untimely in 2016. Military authorities, in order to get a fairly robust and nuanced perspective on what was going on and to make sense of the contradictions within this region. Now, the demands of insurgents are mainly 4, and these demands are also in sync with the demands of activists who essentially deploying non-violent tactics, so NGOs and community groups and activists essentially have the same demands on the Nigerian state. And that is fascinating because the objectives, the goals are the same, but clearly their methodologies are different. That has implications for how the actions of insurgents in this region are in fact perceived. Now, so I divide the waves of kidnapping, the instrumentalization of kidnapping in this region into 4. For the first 2 waves, I draw on essentially existing scholarly work, particularly by the scholar Benjamin Okaba, whom I had the opportunity to interview as well in the course of my field work. And his argument is that the first wave, 1960 to 1990, keep in mind oil was discovered in 1956, commercial exploitation began in 1958, but by 1960, you had instances where communities would ask their young people, predominantly males, to go and kidnap a couple of oil workers as a way of making demands for things like scholarships and roads, clinics, and so on behalf of their community. And this was generally seen as somewhat a straightforward process, and there wasn't any significant level of panic. It seemed at the time around what was going on. It was considered peaceful negotiations. Now, the second wave, the second wave had a much more eclectic and diverse repertoires of protest in the region. Kidnapping continued. Oil theft was also something that began at a fairly intense scale at this period. And there was this growing emphasis on so-called high-value targets, with American oil workers at the pyramidal peak of that, followed by Britons and Canadians and and others. And the claim, at least in theory, by the insurgents was that they were trying to draw attention to the plight of the Niger Delta. And the third wave, my analysis shows, the explicit demand for ransom began, and of course, this huge growth in the number of insurgent groups and kidnapping incidents also grew at a tremendous rate. The fourth wave, which I consider the current wave from 2010 up to the present moment, the sporadic kidnappings, and so from an era in which kidnappings in this region was putatively connected to the wider struggle for environmental and socioeconomic justice, we now have a scenario where people were totally unconnected to the oil industry, being kidnapped, and a lot of these kidnappings, the current forms of kidnappings of individuals who are in fact unconnected to the oil industry. And since the rise of a relatively new group, the Niger Delta Avengers, which launched itself in February of 2016, there has been this conscientious and rigorous effort by the insurgents to destroy oil infrastructure. That has become a main tactic that has been used since early 2016 for reasons related to the political process, as I would talk about in a moment. Now, in terms of the factors influencing these waves of kidnapping, my analysis shows that this developments in the Niger Delta region intertwined with the developments of the political arena. And so the contestations for power, the successive military dictatorships and their tendency towards oppression of peaceful protests in the region, political brinksmanship during civilian administrations, particularly the ethnically and religiously tinged dimensions of the distribution of government positions and portfolios, and generally who gets what, when, and how. And of course, the social movements in the region, especially the peaceful social movements, particularly the movement for the survival of Ogoni people, MOSAP, that Ken Saro-Wiwa, the man whose image I showed earlier, established, and the way and manner in which that peaceful movement was crushed was the most egregious manner. So Ken Saro-Wiwa Sr., for instance, was not only hanged, acid was in fact poured on his body. Soldiers were deployed to guard his grave, almost like they were fearing some kind of resurrection or thereabout. And so the brutality that accompanied this protest led younger individuals, a whole new generation, to dispense with nonviolent forms of protest. And of course, socioeconomic crisis and the pervasive levels of unemployment in the area. And Asari Dokubo, whose image I showed earlier, was quoted in a newspaper talking about the need to compel oil workers to recruit from the region, that unless they were recruiting most of their staff from the region, there was not going to be any peace in that area. So these were some of the broader concerns of these individuals. Very quickly, the public support for these kidnappings was also fairly staggering. And as I argue in my work, attempting to delineate nonviolent protesters from the violent agitators is a fool's errand, in part because of the symmetry of their demands, and it's almost a telepathic understanding that, well, you know, we can't do that, but we understand why those young men and women engaged in this kidnapping. So, and I pulled out a few quotes here and there just to see the range of individuals, the range of actors in the region who tacitly lend support, or at least demonstrate a modicum of understanding for the kidnappings going on in the region, even though they were not involved in this enterprise. And of course, the idea that there was a war situation in the region and that kidnapping was just an act of war, and that, by the way, well, kidnapping, there are things that are worse than kidnapping, such as when the military bombs your house. That's far worse. than kidnapping. And of course, up to the corridors of power as well. In military, generals talking about politicians from the region lending support for their operations within the region, but fearing reprisal if they ever went public supporting military operation in the region. Now, I'm just going to skip that because of time. Now, but more on the grievances against its foreign oil workers. Now, I consider this quote one of the most articulate of those quotes. This was a university graduate who was amongst the ranks of the kidnappers. And he says that he considers them being the oil workers as instruments of oppression, and agents of colonialism. These oil workers come to work in our community, impregnate our girls, do shady things with our money, then the community, and I'm jobless. You want me to be happy? Now, it's a remarkably composed statement in that it construes the oil worker, the foreign oil worker, as an order and a colonialist order. And of course, the world historical policing of gendered sexual boundaries is also evident in that. And it goes into great details in the interview, talking about mixed race kids in the Niger Delta and how they didn't like that, in that this oil workers were simply sleeping with the women and all of that. And that seemed to be a major angst that they had against the oil workers as well. Now, but at a more structural level or macro sociological level, there is the sense that oil workers were simply, these foreign oil workers were simply sacrificial lamb. Now, because oil infrastructure, oil companies were often the only governmental presence in many of these communities. And so, as one insurgent puts it, since I cannot get hold of the government, it's the oil workers I can physically see. And so if you want to get the attention of the government, they felt that kidnapping oil workers was the way to do it. And of course, the disparities in living standards, perceived preferential treatment of foreign oil workers in a lot of these companies, and those narratives go around because there are local oil workers who tell their community members their experiences in those organizations and so forth. And I mentioned this earlier, the perception of some of ostensible moral bankruptcy of these oil workers. And of course, in some cases with fairly ridiculous levels of exaggeration that they were somehow spreading HIV/AIDS and so on. Now, but more to the main research question, that is this protest or criminal expropriation? I think we can view this in a number of ways. And first is through what Ruggiero calls anti-institutional violence or violence from below. And then there's been a lot that's been done on that line of research. I also draw on and view this as sort of a symbol of what Jean-Francois Bayard and his colleagues call the criminalization of politics and the state, the privatization and personalization of power, the usurpation of the apparatus and architectures of state power by private, extra-state, extra-legal entities. And of course, kidnapping in this sense also becomes a form of resistance against state exploitation, as well as a challenge to globalization, or what Naomi Klein would call disaster capitalism. And it's a way, as may be evident through the image I showed earlier about the American oil workers, it's a way of almost transnationalizing their struggle, ensuring that major world superpowers are drawn into the conflict. But for some of the other insurgents, particularly those who founded various insurgent groups, this was a basic mechanism for accessing conventional ladders of opportunity, becoming materially and symbolically successful in the country. And a couple of them were, in fact, handed cabinet positions in some of those states in that region. Again, partly because of the instrumentality of the kinds of violence that they deployed. Now, I don't have time to go into that, but there was a very clear commingling of criminality in what was going on. It was not. It was no longer a question of protest. As I wrap up, Now, I found that the role of a benevolent insurgent commander was critical. And so in oil-producing communities where they had at least one benevolent insurgent commander who deployed their resources to providing basic social services and so forth, such communities were generally favorable to kidnapping. They would consider those kidnappings as a form of protest by their people. But the communities that lacked any benevolent insurgent commander would consider those kidnappings as mere criminal act rather than viewing those acts as social banditry. I'm not sure I have time to go into all of the implications, unfortunately, but at the minimum, I'm just going to pick a couple of things there. Clearly, in understanding kidnapping in any context, the historical, political, economic, and cultural contexts matter, and it's important that this various strands are brought together. And of course, as a criminologist, I consider that crime and protest often tend to trend together. And there's a small body of literature suggesting that. And this is particularly relevant in the case of kidnapping. In attempts to understand kidnapping in any context, we must consider how protest and crime trend together. And of course, the fragility of the legitimacy of states. That states must be able to demonstrate over and over again and on a regular basis why they are in fact relevant to people. When a state fails in that basic responsibility, it does lose a chunk of its legitimacy, and that may create avenues for incidents like this. And finally, and this came up in one of our sessions yesterday, the need to problematize the notion of crime, what we in fact view as crime. On that note, I'd like to thank you for listening.
Thank you.